write your questions out and we will handle them at the end of our session today, about quarter of the hour. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you may be. We have three wonderful speakers today to think about the future of history of science and technology and history of science and technology for the future. And I will introduce each speaker as we go through and hope that we can state a time, which I'm sure everybody is very anxious to do. We only have an hour for this session. Our first speaker is Lisa Onaga, who's a senior research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and is a new member of the German National Committee for our division of the history of science and technology. And she's particularly interested in the animal-human interface in the laboratory, in agricultural science, and in health and industrial settings. And she is going to speak to us today, I think, about proteins and fibers. I have not had the title before me, but perhaps you will explain to us as we go through what it is you're going to talk about. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here. My talk is entitled, let me just show a couple of slides to guide us through. So this talk is entitled Interdisciplinary Entanglements in the History of Science. And I'm going to give you a perspective on the contemporary developments in history of science and technology that were shared and developed in close conversation with Maria Carla Gadebusch, the chair of the German National Committee for the History of Science here. And rather than report on a state of the entire field, we want to use the theme of entanglement to contemplate some observations about the place of history of science in Germany. So entanglement is a term you may have heard. It's borrowed from quantum physics that's been adapted since Karen Barad's 2007 feminist STS work on ontology and agency, meeting the universe halfway. And in its original meaning, entanglement refers to the phenomenon when two particles, like a pair of photons, remain connected even when they're separated at distance. So on the human scale, you might think of this like the same way a tango dance emerges when two individuals coordinate together. So the scientists think of an entanglement as an emergent property. And since Barad, it's been especially used by many scholars across the humanities and social sciences, as well as in disciplines like archaeology. So the spatial imagery conveyed by the entanglement metaphor has been adapted recently in the medical humanities because it helps impress the different territories of concern between humanistic and clinical thought that pose both challenges and opportunities to practitioners and scholars to consider what should be integrated in a field or discipline, and if so, how. So one of the trends that we see here in Germany is the steady aggregation of scholars working across the humanities, including in history of science, in new categories of scholarship with broad labels like medical humanities, environmental humanities, and this is in addition to science and technology studies. To highlight some examples, there's the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies of Science, which focuses on social epistemology of science, and that is situated at the Faculty of History, Philosophy, and Theology at the University of Bielefeld. The new Environment and Society doctoral program at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, the new Department of STS at the Technical University of Munich School of Social Science and Technology, the Kate Hamburger Kolleg Cultures of Research. This is at Aachen University, International Center for Advanced Studies in Philosophy, Sociology, and History of Science and Technology. And then there's the Institute for Medical Humanities in Bonn and the Medical Humanities Department in Berlin Charité. And these two embody new impulses of critical medical humanities, and they're both embedded in medical schools. And finally, at my own research institute, the launch of the International Max Planck Research School, a doctoral program organized around the theme of knowledge and its resources, is one of these examples of entanglements in the humanities and social sciences. So historians of science working in these contexts, whether or not they study topics like physics and computational science, technology, engineering, bioscience, or the environment are often in academic settings adjacent to medical schools or STEM schools, or in some way are also expected to have the dexterity to weigh in on contemporary issues like complexity, sustainability, resource management, medical ethics. It may appear that the goal of an interdisciplinary endeavor would be to become institutionalized and gain coherence as a discipline. Even if this type of aggregation may not be prominent for all subfields, there are also other efforts like the history of this History for Physics exchange program, and that enables history of science, historians of scientists and physicists to interact. And that's organized jointly by the Historical Epistemology of the Final Theory program of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the Institute for Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna. New co-supervision formats for MA and PhD students between physics and humanity faculties also try to foster new researchers with both rigid physical science training and a broad education, encouraging free thinking necessary for humanities work. So this notion of entanglement encourages us to envision a juxtaposition of things that are not usually seen together, but are nonetheless tied together. Growing in scholarly structures of deliberate entanglement have highlighted the value of interdisciplinarity, and this growth also relates to degrowth elsewhere as traditional chairs in history of science embedded within specific scientific departments become less on trend. So questions about the continuity of tradition and the need to respond to whatever new normal seems to be thrown at us seemingly every year add to that shifting reality. And that's not in the least because of the pandemic, refugee crises, climate change, economic instability, the war in Ukraine. The role of historians of science seems to be more important than ever. The political significance of dangerous reinterpretations of history in contemporary conflicts shows that history is a vulnerable asset that needs to be protected. And reading into this scenario, we recognize the widening ambit of historians to find a place within this ambiguous and risky intellectual space of the interdisciplinary entanglement. So, like in many different places, issues like pandemic that impact society have compelled many colleagues to contribute to public discourse, whether it's on their own volition or because they were recognized as experts. In 2020, at the Max Planck Institute, for example, we developed a humanities solidarity project called History of Science on Call. And this is a video series highlighting the work of different historians of science and scholars in allied fields who've expertise to lend on pandemic matters. And the pandemic highlighted the challenge of pursuing simultaneously the craft of history and public engagement, a daunting task when lay people do not always find the reflexive analytical approaches of history and philosophy of science convenient. At the same time, these challenges opened up opportunities to synthesize historical research by allowing historians to offer updated historical context about phenomena like zoonosis or predictive modeling, for instance. One emergent task for historians of science became to be vigilant and fight distortions. This also means we need to communicate broadly and not only write for the scientific community. In short, we cannot only stay in that comfort zone of academia, even if that is interdisciplinary. The acute problem of the pandemic has shown that historians of science and medicine do not only fulfill the role of providing commentaries on the nature of epidemic diseases, historians are also observers of the contemporary as much as they are analysts of the past. However, an entanglement is not always something that's a choice. This spatial metaphor can be understood another way. What has already been entangled also directs how areas of practice, publics, and scholarship interact with each other. Entanglement as a precondition becomes evident as questions of history appear repeatedly in contemporary culture. Vibrant discussions, for example, spurred by the film Oppenheimer recently, remind that historical scholarship is a resource for culture, and such films are not just materials for teaching the past, but provide context for discussing the present. They help renew interest in the history of science, especially in the context of the history of war, as well as the relationship between science and international diplomacy. So not too far off from the eastern border of this country, the war in Ukraine persists. Recent developments compel historians in this post-war, post-pandemic context to maintain an active memory of the painful atrocities of the last century, however fatigued later generations have become of carrying these burdens. This work is not just about the form of rehearsing lessons of history, but similarly to the pandemic, it invites a chance to examine archives afresh, to ask new questions that might help make greater sense of the present. So a film like Oppenheimer highlights that impulse, as the director Christopher Nolan stresses that today's uncertainties about the regulation of artificial intelligence echo issues raised by nuclear science and weapons regulation of the mid-20th century. Historians of science here have been addressing the development of this topic too, analyzing how dual-use technologies, research, and funding regimes get disentangled. So multiple scenarios are in play. Historians of science have already been examining issues that were set into gear in the past and are able to join broader public discourse. The challenge is how to make good use of pre-existing inherited entanglements and find ways to maintain relevance, making use of our methodologies to connect with acute problems of historical significance. So we're entangled with the present and have to join strategically and choose research methods that may sometimes differ from one's original training. We historians not only have a responsibility to get involved synchronously with other fields and disciplines, but we're positioned to get involved diachronously. Thus, doing history of science involves both analyzing what has been found and relating that beyond our immediate peer groups. And it's becoming more difficult to justify doing history of science if we're not willing to thoughtfully tango with or occasionally get entangled with societal concerns. So just to wrap up, what arises is a view of history of science research that is not only topically driven, but one that can be understood in the form of mixed methods. There's a landscape of third-party research funding here, Drittmittel, that fundamentally shapes how research works and functions in Germany. The German Research Foundation infuses the research landscape with momentum and vibrancy in this way. So interdisciplinarity is structured into long-term projects that are renewable in 5-year increments or so. So a couple examples, the cluster of excellence matters of activity, image space material, and roots, social, environmental, and cultural connectivity in past societies, as well as collaborative research centers like episteme in motion, transfer of knowledge from the ancient world to the early modern period. These all change how we talk about research over the long term. And this is especially because they're interdisciplinary and are using mixed methods. So to receive fellowships and support, one has to be able to become a person who is able to interact in a concrete results-driven way to find these juxtapositions fruitfully and pair up with colleagues with complementary methodologies. To make enlightening contributions based on knowledge about the genesis of phenomena and problems of today, one needs to interfere responsibly, both synchronously and diachronously, with multiple vectors of entanglement. So methodologically, interdisciplinarity has to be thought of as a way of doing things cognizant of the entanglements that are inherited and created deliberately alike. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lisa, for this humane and very thoughtful insight into the challenges of today. And I very much enjoy or very much welcome the possibility of talking about the terminology of entanglement. Spatial imagery is really quite significant here. So thank you very much for your view from Germany. We're moving now to the view from the United States, where we have Professor Joseph Martin, who's a historian of modern science and technology and a philosopher of science in the Department of History at is it Durham, UK or Durham, United States?
It's Durham, UK. So
Durham, UK,
I am American, so I'll offer a mid-Atlantic perspective.
Oh, he's going to offer a mid-Atlantic perspective. So I'm sorry to have messed that up. So Joseph was trained in the United States, is now in the UK, and is in a wonderful position to offer us some further insights on this topic. Thank you. Over to you, Joe.
Great. Thanks very much, Janet, for the introduction. I also want to thank Alexander Stoger, who helped us set up this whole, the technical side of things. And I'm pleased to be here speaking with you representing the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, which seeks, among other things, to pursue integration in some sense of the word, or failing that, at least contact between the history and philosophy of science. So my goal for today is to give you one perspective on why that's desirable and how to go about doing it effectively. Thinking about the connections between history and philosophy of science has been something of a motif of my career, and I hope I can offer some provocations on the topic by reviewing the points where I found those connections fruitful. I think it's instructive to begin with an anecdote about my arrival at the University of Minnesota to begin a PhD in the history of science and technology. And when I was there, I crossed the Mississippi River, often multiple times a day, to go attend events at the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And I remember a member of the faculty there, who will remain nameless, was fond of saying that, Minnesota has it right. It has history of science, it has philosophy of science, and it has a mighty river separating them. This is something I was a bit resistant to at the time. I did my BA in the history and philosophy of science and very much believed that they went together quite well. But having spent considerable time on both banks of the Mississippi over my years at Minnesota, I began to better appreciate that sentiment, even though I remain convinced, based on my experience in STS departments and HPS programs and other institutionalizations of the integration of history and philosophy of science, that they can be effectively integrated. I came to understand it not as a prescription to keep them apart, but for a framework for how they can interact constructively by bridging that river. The upshot, more or less, is that I would say if you want productive interdisciplinarity, you need disciplines to be interbetween. History and philosophy both have their own disciplinary norms and standards, and that's a good thing. You aren't always going to be able to get from one bank to the other, but sometimes you can build bridges if you can find firm grounding on both banks. Okay, enough of the metaphor. In my remaining time, I want to answer really two questions. The first is the why question. Why should we think about integrating history and philosophy of science? And to make some gestures at the how question about how we can do this effectively, hopefully building constructively on some of the very salutary points that Lisa made in the previous talk. I think the why question is by no means a trivial one. I don't think we should assume that it's obvious that history and philosophy of science go together. This is a point that Jutta Shikore made quite lucidly and usefully when she asked whether history or philosophy should necessarily choose the other as a natural collaborator rather than to say to turn to anthropology, sociology. She's coming at this as a philosopher of science, saying, look, if history is offering evidence, then we should also think about other places we can get evidence that's not natural, that these are the two things that should go together. And I think that's a point we need to sort of take seriously. Why do we have an international union of history and philosophy of science and technology and not, say, an international union of history and anthropology of science and technology? Some of that, of course, is contingent, right? The IUHPST was set up in 1955. HPS at this point in history is still very much part of the positivist program, right? The idea is that these are disciplines that could support the successful execution of science by discerning how it worked from the philosophical side and enumerating examples of its past success from the historical side. It's fair to say that that's no longer the dominant perspective on the roles of either of those fields. And so perhaps the link between history and philosophy of science is in some sense vestigial. I want to suggest two reasons that that's not necessarily the conclusion that we should draw from that history of our own field. The first has to do with the substance of the topics we're interested in, and that's the fact that scientists never stopped doing philosophy. Science, as we understand it, is relatively new as a way of organizing labor. Even in the mid-1800s, the term would have been understood substantially differently, and many of the people we call scientists would have accepted the label philosopher without complaint. That's a relative truism, I think, in our community. That begins to change in the 20th century, and by the late 20th century, many prominent scientists, so think of Stephen Weinberg, Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, were proclaiming loudly and publicly that science had rendered philosophy obsolete, so very much disavowing explicitly the label of philosopher. I would argue that the fact that scientists stopped calling themselves philosophers didn't mean that they stopped doing philosophy. In many cases, it meant that they started doing philosophy perhaps not as well as they would have otherwise, and because they became systematically unreflective about how their philosophical commitments bore on their work in certain cases. Not true of all scientists, of course, but I think that the disciplinary disposition that's reflected in those anti-philosophical statements coming from Weinberg, Hawking, and others reflect a broader tendency of certain scientific disciplines. I lacked the time to demonstrate this point here, so I'm simply going to assert it. But the upshot is that our historical actors are often doing philosophy themselves. And so from a historian's perspective, we need to engage with philosophical tools more so perhaps than those with other disciplines when we're interested in understanding how those philosophical commitments operate to shape the conceptual and institutional development of those fields. The second point is that the fact that something is contingent doesn't mean that it's disposable necessarily. That is, it doesn't follow from the fact that we no longer believe necessarily in the original reasons for bringing history and philosophy of science together, that we should throw out all that we've gained from their approximation. We do now have the better part of a century under our belts of history and philosophy working together, sometimes quite closely, to address important questions about science. And that has resulted in some fruitful ways of thinking about science that it makes good sense to maintain and keep up. As we intuitively understand as historians, all disciplines are contingent. They're powerful, though, because they've established entrenched modes of practice into which practitioners are then disciplined. So now I'd say that HPS I wouldn't say it's a full discipline. I think it falls short of the full disciplinary status, but it's certainly a tradition. And the contingency of a tradition is not on its own cause to abandon it. Okay, so presuming at least you're willing to entertain the idea that some kind of integration between history and philosophy of science might be a good thing, let me say a few words about the how. It's a question with both individual and institutional components, right? So on the individual side of things, I actually don't think there's much about the history philosophy collaborations that can't be said of interdisciplinary collaborations more generally. So talking about some of the issues that Lisa raised about how you go about collaborating with people who bring different expertise to the table. You have to talk to people in other disciplines. You have to make a real effort to understand the norms and standards to which they're responsive, and you need to make an effort to articulate your own discipline's insights in a way that's legible in those terms. That's true of almost every interdisciplinary encounter you can imagine. And how you go about doing that on the ground, even within history and philosophy collaborations, depends very much on the type of questions you're interested in. I don't know if sort of 1990s stand-up comedian style generalizations, historians drive like this and philosophers drive like that is all that helpful here. I think it really depends on the sorts of questions, the sort of philosophy you're doing, the sort of history you're doing. The larger point is just that successful cross-disciplinary exchange means spilling a little bit of sweat to understand how and why other scholars operate the way they do. Institutionally, I think the situation is a bit more particular. And that's because history and philosophy of science do share an institutional legacy. This event is in part a manifestation of that. And we could also point to university departments, journals, conferences, other traditional disciplinary apparatus dedicated to HPS or something similar. People are more apt to work together to spend that sweat it takes to learn how to speak in other disciplinary tongues if they have more opportunities to work alongside people from other disciplines. When I've collaborated with philosophers myself, it's largely because they happen to be around and we got talking and found a shared area of interest. So if we decide that some form of integration and how we define that is, I think, open to discussion, I'm not going to take a strong stand on it right now. If we decide that that's desirable, then we need to think seriously about how to maintain the institutions that we have encouraged in the past to bring those people together. I could say more about how I think that's been going recently, but I think that might be better left for the discussion. And so I will break here and say thank you very much for coming to this event.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I find it extremely interesting that you would like us to continue and to enhance the integration of philosophy and history of science. There are very many institutional connections that we do need to continue to foster. So we've had a talk on entanglement and a talk on integration and maintenance of interdisciplinary links. I want to thank you very much, Joseph, for bringing this view to us. To our viewers, our Zoomers, if you have questions, it's a good time for you to pop them into the chat now, because we will be moving on very promptly to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Maryam Seyidbeyli, who is the director of the Institute of the History of Science in Azerbaijan, the National Academy of Sciences, and is a specialist in ancient and medieval Azerbaijan, as well as the modern diaspora, which I hope very much you're going to speak a little bit about in your talk. So we are very pleased that you agreed to join us, because we're getting a very insightful view from you as to the difficulties of pursuing the history of science in areas that don't actually often have the structure that we see so much in other places. So over to you, Maryam, please.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the international conference.
Mm-hmm.
I present the Azerbaijan National Academy of Science, established in 1945. For almost 80 years of the history of the Academy of Science has become very famous for many achievements and names of prominent scientists. President of the Academy of Science of Azerbaijan, Seyidbeyli, asked me to welcome on his behalf the community in history and philosophy of science with the important global festival. Research on the history of science and technology in Azerbaijan began to be carried out in 16th of the last century. The Azerbaijan branch of the Soviet National Association for the History and Philosophy of Science was organized in 1916, which included 10 sections: history of physical and mathematical sciences, history of chemical sciences, history of geological, history of geographical, history of biological sciences, history of technology, history of medicine, history of agricultural sciences, logic, methodology and philosophy of science, history of natural science and technology of the ancient world and the Middle Age. Member of the association carried out scientific research on different problems of the history of natural science and technology in Azerbaijan. During the work of the branch, Azerbaijani scientists have prepared many books and articles on these articles in this field. Members of the department regularly took part in various international conferences and symposiums. Thanks to the effort of Soviet scientists, the history of science was turned into a truly international and institutionalized discipline. After the collapse of the Soviet period, research in the field of the history of science and science of science continued at the individual level. And later on, researchers began to rethink the most important problems associated with development of the history of science as a special discipline. The process of the institutionalization of the history of science in Azerbaijan is marked by two significant milestones. The first is mentioned earlier in the 1916s, the second in 2014. In 2014, the Institute of the History of Science was established at Azerbaijan National Academy of Science. The institute has achieved significant success in a short time and gained recognition in the national and global professional communities. It became an associate member of the International Union for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. The Institute has established close relations with many foreign scientific institutions. A number of cooperation agreements were signed with relevant institutes, including the Vavilov Institute for the History of Science and Technology of the Russia Academy of Sciences, Dobrov Institute for the Research of Scientific and Technical Potential and History of Science of the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, Archive of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Galileo Galilei Museum of the History of Science of Italy, Institute for the History of Natural Sciences, China's Academy of Sciences, Institute for the History of Science of the Polish Academy of Sciences. One of the important achievements of the Institute of the History of Science was the establishment of the International Journal History of Science and Science of Science in 2021. The editorial board of the journal includes prominent scientists from around the world, experts in the history of science and science of science. In our works, we popularized manuscript, archival materials, essay, memoirs, the purpose of which was to convey to new generation the features of the scientific activities of outstanding scientists and their contribution of science. In 2022, in connection with the implementation of reform of Academy of Science in Azerbaijan, a number of institutes were reduced. A number were transferred to the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Science and Education, and museums to the introduction of the Ministry of Culture. But despite the reform, we continue to engage in research in the field of the history of science and science of science. And in our opinion, the history of science has a good prospect. At present, we continue to publish the international journal, History of Science and Science of Science. Our scientific international relation with the above-mentioned institutions continue with success. In the future, we would like to set up a center of the history of science and science of science, and we would like to organize a museum of the history of science, which will give a strong impulse to popularize the role of science on the world stage. We plan to hold lectures, excursion for all ages, the formation of youth motivation in choosing a scientific career in the achievements of scientists. And it is also planned to hold popular science events, organize discussions and round table with the involvement of science to give lecture to the public, sounding in an accessible language. These events and project will be able to attract talented young people to science to make scientific research more prestigious. Currently, we are implementing project based on both scientific and educational goals in the field of popularization of science in Azerbaijan and around the world. This project includes coverage of the most significant discoveries and invention of outstanding scientists of our colleagues. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much. You have excelled in making a very compressed talk. Thank you so much. What a lot you have to say in this talk. There is a moment or two if you wish to expand on what you have said. I wonder whether you would like to say a little more about the role of history of science currently in your nation as a vehicle for generating national pride. It's possible you don't hear me too well. So thank you very much indeed, Maryam. We are very good for time, so there is plenty of time for our Zoom audience to type questions into the chat, which I will then relay to our speakers. And I will myself begin the discussion by asking a couple of questions about the terminology we have been using. we have spoken about entanglement, which has a great deal of a more positive imagery than the words interdisciplinary. So I'm very glad to hear more about entanglement as the interdigitation of different areas of thought. And Joseph spoke to us very compellingly about the necessity to integrate, or the continuation of integrating philosophy with history and how to maintain that. And here we have Maryam speaking to us about the very significant changes that have happened in the last 20 years of establishing a historical section in the National Academy of Sciences and some of the functions that that section has been carrying out, particularly producing a journal, supporting education, and fostering a sense of what I would say was pride in the national scientific persons there. So I think we have entanglement, we have integration, and we have the functionality, let's say, of history from our three different regions. I wonder if any of our listeners have any thoughts that they would wish to share with the speakers on this. You can find the chat down here on the bottom of your screen, and you can just type it in, and I will make sure that somebody is going to speak at the question and answer function. We need the questions, please.
Janet, might I say just a little bit in response to your note about terminology while the questions are coming in?
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with this notion of entanglement, which I found quite provocative, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a question of how far we want to take the analogy to physical entanglement of particles. Where, yeah, if two particles are entangled, they in some sense no longer possess individual properties that they might have had otherwise, right? And I think this sort of points to perhaps a little bit of a difference in the vision Lisa was articulating and one I was articulating, where I was sort of advocating more of a foundation in traditional disciplines and coordination between them. What I got from Lisa was a vision of much more sort of looser boundaries and more integration of methods. I mean, integration is perhaps the wrong word, since that's ostensibly the flag I was flying. But I'm curious, Lisa, to what you think about sort of the role of traditional disciplines, traditional disciplinization of practitioners in a world where we're trying to coordinate shared methods, diverse expertise directed at quite specific problems.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and thank you so much, Janet, for pointing out some of the overlaps and interesting distinctions between the talks, because it's really important to have a recognition that there are multiple approaches to the disciplines that are running at the same time and actually need to run. And I don't think that with the, I think with the entanglement metaphor, it alerts us to an awareness that we benefit and have benefited from strong training that is disciplinarily grounded. At the same time, we also benefit from recognizing the emergence of other kinds of scholarship and students that are drawing from existing methodological groundings. And so what we see is, to just push it a little bit further, these kind of emergent constellations of people that are also being encouraged because of whatever, perhaps there might be some other completely structural, practical reasons why different disciplines or departments come together, which I'm not going into. But looking at it from just a purely intellectual exercise, we do need to recognize that this is happening. And such individuals and such institutions and colleges can really address things that previously hadn't been addressed or addressable, in turn giving us new language with which to identify and explore questions. So yeah, I think these can work synergistically together with, at the same time, what Joseph, what you're talking about, and also Maryam. I'm really fascinated by the efforts that are taking place and your perspective on medieval history too, because this is, I see some of the great changes coming about as medieval history and so on. History of the ancient period really is becoming more and more prominent.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I have a question here on the chat that comes in from Gordon McQuat from Canada. So it's principally directed for Joseph, but I think our other speakers may wish to consider it as well. Gordon says that in Canada, historians and philosophers get along pretty well together. And so he's wondering they collaborate, but he does see that we still see the traditional analytic philosophy of science is a little resistant to what is now happening in the historical studies of science. So his question, should we reach out beyond the traditional Anglo-American analytical philosophy? And how might we do that? Have you some thoughts on that without taking us deeply away from our focus here?
Yeah, I can say a few things about that.
Thank you.
It reminds me of one of my favorite jokes, which is that about the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, which is that analytic philosophers accuse continental philosophers of being insufficiently clear, whereas continental philosophers accuse analytic philosophers of being insufficiently. And that, I think, kind of gets at sort of the heart of the frustration I think Gordon is articulating, where there's a certain stripe of analytic philosophy where they see history, it might be useful as an exemplification, but it's not useful as evidence. If it turns out that the historical case study doesn't map onto the philosophical program, well, so much the worse for the history, right? It's just a bad example of how things should have been done. I think that can make it difficult to have productive interactions. And I think what the Anglo-American tradition can get from a continental tradition is that the continental tradition is often much more ecumenical in what it's willing to take in. So I think what you see a lot in the tradition of philosophy of science and practice, for instance, which is quite strong in Canada and certainly the northern bits of North America, where I've spent much of my time, does, I think, bring in some of that more ecumenical sensibility. I won't pretend to be au fait with continental philosophy, but I think that is something that we can get from that tradition.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a question for Maryam about the structures that there may be in Azerbaijan for promoting history of science. For example, our question is, are there any bachelor's programs, BA programs, master's programs in universities in Azerbaijan?
Thank you very much for your questions. It's very interesting questions, and it's a relevant topic because our future generation should know our history in Azerbaijan and in the world. Unfortunately, we don't have such program in bachelor and master degree, unfortunately, in universities. And we hope this problem will be solved in the future. And now we haven't this program.
Some of us will recall how the field began as an academic topic in the 1930s and 40s in Western Europe. So it will be very interesting when it develops in your area to see the very different criteria that are called upon. So I will be interested, please let us all know when there are programs in Azerbaijan. So we have the question that is a classic question in the history of science. Is it how much attention do you feel as individuals representing your geographical regions, how much attention are the specialists paying to the basic questions of the importance of multiple interpretations, that one can always, as a historian, emphasize that there are many different ways of interpreting matters of the past. And a philosopher, one tends to assume, is seeking rather more immovable truths. Might you, perhaps, Lisa, wish to speak to that? How would entanglement handle the matter of positivism, for example?
Fascinating question. So one of the things about the entanglement approach, or what I think is a strength of it, at least, is a way to recognize the possibility that these conversations can happen across, not just within science, within the humanities and the social sciences, but with the scientific community. And I think that is one of the key points that is important to take away from this message. So I'll just give some examples. I mentioned the matter of activity cluster of excellence, which I have some interaction with in my projects too. And the approach there is to together explore common things, common objects, and then bring together and collect questions and realize that some of these questions are in fact similar, but can require different approaches to examine, whether it's through this examination of historical archival material or through a scanning electron microscope. And so these are really excellent strategies, I think, that are happening right now. For example, it's not even just historians, but also with our anthropologists. And the envelopes are all pushed from all different directions to ask, like, how far is this a sensible, reliable explanation for an intangible, what seems to be just an experienced observation. So these are dynamics that are constantly there. It's through the conversation that happens over a long period of time that some of the results can be found. And so one of the things I would underscore with entanglement is that there has to be commitment too, if it's a deliberate one. And it can take a lot of time, and that is to the credit of these clusters of excellence and other research designs of research projects that take into account that some of the breakthroughs and some of the work that bridge these different kind of so-called realist, positivist, relativist perspectives, they take a lot of time to puzzle through together, because if you try to compress that in a very narrow time scale, it just reproduces the same sort of hitting your head against the walls and having the same kind of conversations. But that, well, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. It seems to me that sometimes one of the better ways of proceeding with multiple approaches in a cluster of researchers is that you are all focusing on one specific historical issue that has continued through to the present day, so that people can bring their own expertise to a group that is willing to hear it, but it's not going to be the dominant expertise. I'm thinking here perhaps, and maybe Joseph will know about this, is the Black Hole Initiative, which has philosophers, of course, astronomers, mathematicians, computer engineers, all kinds of people working together on the one thing. You spoke to us about several of the different institutions in Germany that have a structure for interdisciplinarity and entanglement, wanting to foster entanglement. Are they focusing on one specific thing? Am I mistaken in this belief?
So I cannot speak for all of the many projects that are in the country, but some of the structures of the organizations afford the spaces for bringing in multiple kinds of scholars who do have different methodological approaches and are interested in different kinds of things. And the possibility for coming together and then engendering collaborative projects or building out conversations is made possible. That seems to be one of the things that we can observe and is value in terms of creating new spaces and conversations that take us into productive zones of research.
Thank you. We have had a question also in the chat, which you can't see at the moment, about early career scholars. Is how significant might the risks be for junior scholars pursuing collaborations? The danger perhaps of not fitting in to current disciplinary structures. I think perhaps we've all had personal experiences of not fitting in occasionally, but if we are thinking of a future for our field where there's really fertile interaction and movement in the structure of knowledge, is this perhaps a little risky for the younger people who are attempting to make a footing and a career in this field? It would apply equally to Joseph's department and to Maryam's Academy of Science. Are the early career scholars opting to stick in a safe disciplinary structure? And should we be encouraging them to blossom out of that?
Yeah, I can add a thought or two. First of all, hi, Floris. Good to at least see your name pop up on my screen. I mean, I would say it's crudely, I've found that it's probably higher risk earlier in your career, but also easier. I think as you get later in your career, you tend to get more entangled in disciplinary responsibilities in ways that makes it a little bit more difficult to forge the new collaborations with people who also have time consumed by their own disciplinary commitments. So it's a lot easier earlier in your career, but it is, I mean, there are some risks to it. I was asked, even just being a historian of science, you're already suspect in some corners of history. I was asked once in a job interview for an American history position, so you're a historian of science and technology, are you an American historian? All right, so sort of whether I fit in the category of the job was even suspect because my PhD is in history of science and technology. So I think there are risks. There are also opportunities, right? If you expand your network to other disciplines, you will find out about other funding streams that might value and insist sometimes on interdisciplinary collaborations. So I wouldn't discourage an early career scholar from pursuing those sorts of interactions. But I would say you should be aware of how disciplinary attitudes operate and how you figure out how to talk, and not just to people in other disciplines, but to people in your home discipline to explain what it is that you're doing, because they might not always know instinctually what it is that you're up to.
Thank you. Maryam, have you some thoughts on this question about younger scholars?
Я сама скажу вырасти вот учеников. Он тут наперед. Ну, он лишь наперед. Как сказать? Myself, I give education in 14 people, 14 young people.
And are they working in your field, in ancient and medieval studies?
Yes, that's medical science. And now just a moment. My studies is middle age and sorry. The middle age, I research in middle age and translate in manuscript in Arab language and Persian language and research. It's very interesting research. And now I'm finished write book about Middle Age, the Mongol period. Period Ismailer. History of science. The history of science.
This sounds fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for you.
So we have, am I right? I would wish to know for sure. You have in your institute 14 or 15 people?
Yes, 14 young. No. I give education of 15 people, our young people, and the institute consists for 35 people. Consist for 45 people
Of scholars.
Scholars, yes.
That sounds very agreeable.
The people different, special. Mathematics, philosophy, historical, and other.
Thank you. We have had a question inquiring of the three regions that we have here in our panel, how much effort goes into school education in the history and philosophy of science.
School education and history. School education is we haven't.
No. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. In the UK, so the students coming to university mostly have had no history of science, maybe a little bit of history of medicine, which, because of the structure of the education system here, means you have to work quite hard to recruit your students into your modules. Since we typically only teach in a history department, we'll only teach history students. As opposed to drawing in many science students, at least in my university. So that those institutional dynamics of how education work have widespread consequences for how the discipline develops in a nation. So I think that's a great question.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And Lisa, in Germany?
And, yeah, I was just thinking about the fact of the kind of I wouldn't say it's unstable, but it's a changing landscape of what a department looks like and so on. It requires students to be more resilient, perhaps, in addition to just simply following the lines of traditional education. So in addition to applying to a program, thinking constantly about like possibility of applying to something like a DFK grant to pursue a project, and then slotting into a program is one of the strategies that is also out there. So the students have different kinds of backgrounds, whether it's in the sciences or something in the humanities, and often enter at the MA program level in the history of science. But here at the Max Planck Institute, we have something called the International Max Planck Research School. So it's a doctoral program, and the students all are required to have an MA first, and they can come from all different countries, including within Germany, and receive an education that is focused on the history of knowledge. So,
thank you. And it's time for us to call this very interesting session to an end. I wish particularly to thank our three speakers, Joseph, Lisa, and Maryam, who've all been extraordinarily interesting and engaged. Thank you very much for giving us your insights. And I think all of us here on the Zoom would like to thank Alexander, who has been quietly behind the scenes helping us out.